As the day quietly fades and stars begin to whisper above, welcome to Korean History Whispers. Tonight, we journey into the mind of Eulji Mundeok, the shadow general whose masterful strategy shattered an empire. While the battle's outcome is etched in the annals of time, tonight you will sense the quiet determination that made it possible. Close your eyes and let his whispered memories carry you to peaceful sleep. In the annals of military history, few figures are as enigmatic as the man who would become known as the architect of one of the most devastating defeats ever inflicted upon a Chinese empire. Unlike other legendary commanders whose lives are documented from birth to death, Eulji Mundeok emerges from the mists of history like a phantom warrior, appearing at the crucial moment when his nation's survival hung in the balance, only to vanish back into obscurity once his impossible task was complete. Who was this mysterious general who would humble the mighty Sui Dynasty and alter the course of East Asian history? The frustrating truth is that we know almost nothing about the man behind the legend. No birth records survive. No family genealogies trace his lineage. No childhood stories illuminate his character. He appears in the historical record like a force of nature rather than a human being, defined entirely by his actions during a few crucial months in the year 612. This absence of personal detail has spawned numerous theories about Eulji Mundeok's origins, each reflecting different perspectives on the multicultural nature of Goguryeo society during its golden age. Some scholars, noting that Chinese sources record his name as Eulji Wend, suggest he may have been descended from the Shanbei, those nomadic warriors who had played such a crucial role in the fall of earlier Chinese dynasties. The similarity between Yizi and Weishi, a known Shanbei clan name, has led some to propose that he was actually a foreign-born general who had found service in the Goguryeo court. Others point to his obvious mastery of Chinese literary forms, evidenced by the elegant poem he would later compose for his enemies, as proof that he must have received a classical education. This theory suggests he may have been born in the former territories of Leling or Defang, those Chinese administrative regions that had been absorbed into Goguryeo during its expansion. Perhaps he was the scion of a Chinese aristocratic family that had chosen loyalty to their Korean rulers over ethnic solidarity with their ancestral homeland. Yet a third school of thought rejects these foreign origins entirely, arguing that Eulji was not a family name at all, but rather a title or honorific meaning, something like elder or patriarch. According to this interpretation, the man we know as Eulji Mundeok was actually a pure-blooded Goguryeo warrior, whose real name has been lost to history, remembered only by the respectful title his subordinates used when speaking of their revered commander. The truth, as is so often the case with figures from this distant era, remains tantalizingly out of reach. What we can say with certainty is that by 612, when he first appears in historical sources, Eulji Mundeok had already established himself as one of Goguryeo's most capable military leaders. His reputation was sufficiently established that the Sui emperor would specifically order his capture, suggesting that Chinese intelligence networks had identified him as a particularly dangerous opponent. But to understand the significance of Eulji Mundeok's eventual triumph, we must first examine the world in which he lived, and the forces that would make his victory so crucial for Korea's survival. The early 7th century was a time of dramatic transformation across East Asia. As ancient power structures crumbled, and new empires rose to challenge the established order, Goguryeo itself was the product of centuries of expansion and consolidation that had transformed a modest tribal confederation into one of the great powers of medieval Asia. The kingdom had reached its zenith under two remarkable rulers whose reigns spanned more than a century of almost continuous military success. King Goguryeo, whose very name meant broad expansion of territory, had pushed Goguryeo's borders deep into Manchuria and the Korean peninsula between 391 and 413, creating an empire that stretched from the Mongolian steppes to the Yellow Sea. His sons, King Jiangsu, had continued this aggressive expansion during his extraordinarily long reign from 413 to 491, consolidating Goguryeo's control over vast territories, and establishing the kingdom as the dominant power in Northeast Asia. Under these two rulers, Goguryeo had not merely survived but thrived, absorbing countless smaller tribes and kingdoms while successfully resisting Chinese attempts at reconquest. The secret of Goguryeo's success lay not just in military prowess, but in its ability to adapt and integrate diverse populations into a cohesive political system. The kingdom's strength came from its willingness to incorporate the best elements of various cultures, Chinese administrative techniques, nomadic military tactics, and indigenous Korean social structures, into a uniquely effective form of governance that could mobilize enormous resources for both defense and expansion. X's golden age of expansion had been made possible by China's own weakness and division. For centuries, the collapse of the Han Dynasty had left the Chinese heartland fragmented among competing warlords and ephemeral kingdoms. The period known as the 5 Dynasties and 16 Kingdoms had created a power vacuum that ambitious neighbors like Goguryeo were quick to exploit, expanding their influence while Chinese states were too busy fighting each other to mount effective resistance. But this favorable situation was not destined to last forever. In 589, a new and formidable power emerged from the chaos of Chinese disunity, when the Sui Dynasty succeeded in reunifying the vast territories of the former Han Empire. For the first time in centuries, a single Chinese state controlled resources and manpower that dwarfed anything its neighbors could hope to match. The rise of the Sui Dynasty represented an existential threat to all of China's neighbors. But perhaps nowhere was this threat more keenly felt than in the halls of power in Pyongyang. Goguryeo's expansion had been built on the assumption that Chinese weakness would continue indefinitely, allowing the Korean kingdom to gradually absorb ever larger portions of what had once been Chinese territory. The sudden appearance of a unified and aggressive Chinese empire threw all these calculations into chaos. The Sui emperors, for their part, viewed Goguryeo's expansion as an intolerable affront to Chinese dignity and a direct threat to imperial security. From their perspective, the Korean kingdom had taken advantage of Chinese weakness to seize territories that rightfully belonged to the Middle Kingdom. The restoration of Chinese unity made the recovery of these lost lands both possible and necessary for the new dynasty's legitimacy. Emperor Wen, the founder of the Sui Dynasty, initially pursued a cautious policy toward his northern neighbors, focusing on internal consolidation and the completion of Chinese reunification. But even during this relatively peaceful period, tensions were mounting as both sides prepared for what seemed like an inevitable confrontation between expanding Korean ambitions and reviving Chinese power. The first serious clash came in 598, triggered not by Chinese aggression, but by Goguryeo's own decision to launch a preemptive strike against Sui positions. King Yongyang, recognizing that Chinese reunification posed a fundamental threat to his kingdom's independence, decided that offense was the best defense. A Goguryeo army of 10,000, reinforced by Mughal tribal allies, struck across the Liao River to attack Chinese outposts in what is now Liaodong province. The attack achieved tactical surprise, but ultimately proved to be a strategic miscalculation. Emperor Wen's response was swift and overwhelming. A massive invasion force of 300,000 soldiers poured across the Yalu River, determined to crush Goguryeo resistance once and for all. The sheer scale of this retaliation demonstrated that the Chinese were no longer the weak and divided adversaries that previous Goguryeo kings had learned to exploit. Yet even this massive force proved insufficient to break Goguryeo's resistance. The Chinese invasion of 598 became bogged down in siege warfare against heavily fortified cities, while disease and the onset of winter took a terrible toll on soldiers who were far from their supply bases. Chinese commanders, accustomed to fighting in the relatively benign climate of central China, discovered that warfare in the harsh northern climate of Goguryeo territory presented challenges they had not anticipated. The combination of determined resistance, difficult terrain, and logistical problems forced the Chinese to abandon their invasion before achieving any significant objectives. This failure represented more than just a tactical setback. It was a humiliating reminder that Chinese military superiority was not absolute, and that even a reunified empire could be stymied by determined opponents fighting on their home ground. The unsuccessful invasion of 598 led to a temporary diplomatic solution that satisfied Goguryeo, recognizing that it had barely survived the first test of Chinese power, sent envoys to negotiate a saving settlement that would prevent immediate retaliation. Emperor Wen, equally aware that his forces had failed to achieve their objectives, was willing to accept Goguryeo's diplomatic overtures, rather than risk another expensive and uncertain campaign. The peace that followed was more of an armed truce than a genuine reconciliation. Both sides used the respite to strengthen their military capabilities and refine their strategic plans for the next round of confrontation. Goguryeo focused on improving its fortifications and developing new tactics for fighting against numerically superior Chinese forces. The Chinese, meanwhile, began planning an even more massive invasion that would overwhelm Korean resistance through sheer weight of numbers. This delicate balance was shattered in 604, when Emperor Yang took the throne and immediately signaled his intention to pursue a more aggressive foreign policy. Unlike his father, who had been content with symbolic acknowledgement of Chinese suzerainty, Yang was determined to achieve actual conquest and incorporation of neighboring territories into direct Chinese administration. The new emperor's ambitions extended far beyond the mere recovery of territories lost during China's period of disunity. Yang envisioned a restored Chinese empire that would surpass even the glorious Han Dynasty in its territorial extent and cultural influence. Korea, with its strategic location controlling access to the Liaodong Peninsula, and its proven ability to threaten Chinese positions in Manchuria, was a natural target for these expansionist dreams. Yang Dai's ascension to the throne marked the beginning of a new and more dangerous phase in Sino-Korean relations, where his father had been willing to accept diplomatic solutions and compromise settlements. The new emperor viewed any limitation on Chinese power as an unacceptable challenge to imperial dignity. His court was filled with advisors who urged aggressive action against all of China's neighbors, arguing that only decisive military victory could establish the Sui Dynasty's legitimacy as the rightful heir to China's imperial tradition. For Goguryeo, Yang Dai's aggressive rhetoric and obvious military preparations posed a fundamental challenge to the kingdom's continued independence. King Yongyang and his advisors could see that war was coming, but they also understood that the coming conflict would be far more dangerous than anything their kingdom had previously faced. The Chinese forces being assembled were larger and better equipped than any that had previously threatened Korean territory. It was in this atmosphere of mounting tension and inevitable confrontation that Eulji Mundeok began to emerge as one of Goguryeo's key military leaders. While we cannot trace his earlier career with any precision, it seems clear that by the time Yang began his preparations for conquest, the future hero of Salsu River had already established himself as a commander of exceptional ability and trusted judgment. The qualities that would make Eulji Mundeok such an effective opponent were probably already evident to those who served with him during these years of preparation. His calm demeanor under pressure, his quick thinking in crisis situations, and his talent for seeing through enemy deceptions would all prove crucial in the trials ahead. Most importantly, his ability to devise strategies that turned apparent weaknesses into decisive advantages would soon be tested on a scale that would determine his nation's fate. As intelligence reports reached Pyongyang describing the enormous military buildup taking place in Chinese territory, Goguryeo's leaders faced a sobering reality. The kingdom that had expanded so successfully during the period of Chinese weakness was now confronted by a unified empire whose resources dwarfed anything Korea could hope to match. Traditional tactics that had worked against divided Chinese states would be useless against the overwhelming force that Yangdi was preparing to unleash. In this desperate situation, conventional military wisdom suggested that Goguryeo had only two realistic options: either submit to Chinese demands and accept vassal status, or prepare for a heroic last stand that would at least preserve the kingdom's honor, even if it could not ensure its survival. Both alternatives were unacceptable to King Yang and his advisors, who began searching for a third option that might allow their kingdom to survive while maintaining its independence. It was at this crucial juncture that Eulji Mundeok's strategic genius would prove most valuable. While others saw only the impossibly large numbers of the approaching Chinese army, he began to perceive potential weaknesses that could be exploited by a defender willing to think beyond conventional military tactics. The very size of the Chinese force, which seemed to guarantee its success, might actually contain the seeds of its own destruction, if the right strategy could be devised and executed with sufficient skill. The stage was now set for one of the most remarkable military campaigns in Asian history. On one side stood the mighty Sui Empire, commanded by an emperor whose ambitions knew no bounds and supported by military resources that seemed limitless. On the other side was the relatively small kingdom of Goguryeo, defended by fortified cities, and led by generals who understood that they were fighting not just for victory, but for their nation's very existence. Between these two great forces stood Eulji Mundeok, the mysterious general whose name would become synonymous with one of the most devastating military defeats in Chinese history. The boy who had grown up in obscurity was about to become the man whose tactical brilliance would topple an empire and reshape the political landscape of East Asia for centuries to come. As the winter of 611 gave way to spring, Chinese mobilization reached its climax. Across the empire, soldiers were marching toward assembly points. Supplies were being accumulated in enormous quantities, and ships were being prepared for amphibious operations. The largest military force in human history was taking shape. Its ultimate destination, the kingdom of Goguryeo, and its ultimate objective, the final incorporation of Korea into the Chinese imperial system. In Pyongyang, Goguryeo's leaders made their own final preparations for the coming storm. Defenses were strengthened, alliances were confirmed, and strategies were refined for the greatest test their kingdom had ever faced. At the center of these preparations was Eulji Mundeok, no longer an obscure officer but now recognized as one of the realm's most capable defenders. The collision between these tremendous forces would soon produce one of history's most memorable examples of how strategic brilliance and perfect teaming could overcome even the most overwhelming odds. But as the final preparations were made and the last intelligence reports analyzed, even Eulji Mundeok could not have imagined the full scope of what was approaching, or the magnitude of the victory that awaited those brave enough to seize it. The year 612 dawned with omens that would have chilled the hearts of superstitious men. But Emperor Yangdi of the Sui Dynasty was not a man given to supernatural fears. His mind was focused entirely on earthly conquest, and the military machine he was about to unleash would dwarf anything the world had ever seen. What he was planning was not merely an invasion, but a demonstration of imperial power so overwhelming that no nation would ever again dare to challenge Chinese supremacy. The numbers alone defied comprehension. From every corner of the vast Sui Empire, soldiers marched toward assembly points along the northern frontier. The official records, preserved in Chinese historical chronicles, speak of 113300 combat troops mobilized for the Korean campaign. But this staggering figure represented only the fighting men. The support personnel, including engineers, medical staff, cooks, and supply handlers, numbered twice as many again. If these records are accurate, Yangdi had assembled a force of over 3 million men for his Korean adventure. making it the largest military expedition in human history up to that point. The logistics alone were mind-boggling, feeding, equipping, and moving such an enormous army required organizational capabilities that pushed even the mighty Sui Empire to its absolute limits. The mobilization process itself took on epic proportions. For 40 days, columns of soldiers streamed northward along China's ancient roads, their banners stretching beyond the horizon. Local populations watched in awe and terror as this human tide flowed past their villages and towns. Many had never imagined that so many people could exist in the entire world, let alone be assembled for a single military campaign. Yang Dai's strategy was as ambitious as his army was massive. Rather than attempting a single concentrated assault, he planned a coordinated offensive on multiple fronts that would overwhelm Goguryeo's defenses through sheer scale and complexity. The main force, under his personal command, would cross the Yalu River and advance overland toward Pyongyang, crushing resistance through weight of numbers and superior equipment. Simultaneously, a naval expedition under Admiral Lai Hua would sail from the Shandong Peninsula with a fleet of warships and transport vessels. This maritime force would navigate up the Taedong River directly to Pyongyang, bypassing the fortress cities that protected the overland approaches to the Goguryeo capital. The coordination of these two massive operations represented military planning on a scale that had never before been attempted. The emperor's confidence in success was absolute. How could any kingdom, however brave its defenders or strong its fortifications, hope to withstand such overwhelming force? The Korean resistance that had frustrated his father's invasion was about to be crushed by military might so decisive that future generations would remember it as the campaign that finally established Chinese dominance over the entire region. But Yang Dai had made the classic mistake of commanders who possess overwhelming superiority. He had focused in Taiyai. The Korean peninsula was not the relatively flat and accessible landscape of central China, where massive armies could maneuver with relative ease. Goguryeo territory was dominated by mountains, rivers, and heavily fortified cities that had been specifically designed to channel invading armies into killing zones, where superior numbers became liabilities rather than assets. The kingdom's military tradition emphasized defensive warfare, guerrilla tactics, and the ability to make every mile of advance as costly as possible for attacking forces. King Yeongyang and his military commanders, including the mysterious Eulji Mundeok, had spent years preparing for exactly this kind of massive Chinese assault. They understood that they could not hope to match Chinese numbers in open battle. But they also recognized that the very size of the approaching army created vulnerabilities that could be exploited by defenders who fought intelligently rather than heroically. When the Sui invasion finally began in the 6th of February 12, the initial Chinese advances seemed to confirm Yang Dai's optimistic predictions. The main army crossed the Yalu River without significant opposition, and began its methodical advance toward the first major objectives. Chinese engineers, among the most skilled in the world, set about reducing the frontier fortresses that guarded the approaches to Goguryeo's heartland. Yet almost immediately, problems began to emerge that would plague the entire campaign. The fortress city of Liaodong, which Chinese planners had expected to fall within days, proved to be far more formidable than anticipated. Its walls were higher and thicker than intelligence reports had suggested, its defenders more numerous and better equipped than expected, and its strategic position made it impossible to bypass without leaving a dangerous enemy force in the Chinese rear. 4 months, the massive Sui army found itself bogged down in siege warfare against a single city. While precious supplies were consumed, and the fighting season slipped away, Yang Dai, accustomed to the swift victories that had marked his father's reign, grew increasingly frustrated as reports arrived describing minimal progress and mounting casualties. The naval expedition under Lai Hua encountered its own unexpected difficulties. The admiral had expected to face only token resistance from Goguryeo's naval forces, but Korean defenders proved far more capable
than Chinese intelligence had indicated.
The Battle of Pyongyang Bay resulted in a crushing defeat for the Chinese fleet, with many ships lost and thousands of elite Marines killed or captured. By June 9, it had become clear that the campaign was not proceeding according to plan. The massive army that was supposed to steamroll over Korean resistance had been stopped cold by the very cities it was meant to conquer. Worse, the logistical challenges of supplying such an enormous force so far from Chinese territory were beginning to create serious shortages of food, equipment, and ammunition. It was at this critical juncture that Yang De made a decision that would seal the fate of his invasion and create the opportunity for Eulji Mundeok's legendary victory. Rather than acknowledging the failure of his original strategy and withdrawing to regroup, the emperor decided to double down on his commitment to Korean conquest. The solution, as Yang De saw it, was to create a separate striking force that could bypass the fortress cities that had stalled his main army and strike directly at the heart of Goguryeo power. This elite formation would be composed of the best troops from throughout the invasion force, equipped with the finest weapons and supplies, and commanded by the most experienced generals in the Chinese army. The force that Yang De assembled for this desperate gambit numbered 305,000 men, enormous by the standards of most military campaigns, yet considered a light force in the context of the massive invasion army. The troops selected for this mission were veterans of previous campaigns, men who had proven their courage and competence in battle against various enemies of the Sui Empire. Command of this elite strike force was entrusted to two of China's most capable generals, Yu Zhongwen and Yuan Shu. Both men had distinguished themselves in previous campaigns and possessed the kind of strategic thinking and tactical flexibility that such a complex operation would require. Their mission was straightforward in concept, but extraordinarily difficult in execution: march rapidly to Pyongyang, capture or destroy the Goguryeo capital, and force King Yongyang to surrender. The strategy was not without merit. A swift advance by a relatively mobile force might indeed succeed where the massive main army had failed. By avoiding prolonged siege warfare and focusing on rapid movement, the Chinese strike force could potentially reach its objective before Goguryeo defenders could organize effective resistance. But this plan also created exactly the kind of opportunity that Eulji Mundeok had been waiting for throughout the long months of siege warfare. A smaller Chinese force, however elite, would be more vulnerable to the kind of strategic deception and tactical maneuvering that had always been Goguryeo's greatest military assets. The very mobility that made the strike force dangerous also made it potentially isolated and vulnerable to counterattack. As Chinese preparations for this new offensive reached their final stages, Goguryeo intelligence networks reported the enemy's change in strategy to their commanders. For the first time since the invasion began, King Yongyang and his generals saw a realistic opportunity not just to defend their territory, but to inflict a decisive defeat on their enemies. The key to success would be drawing the Chinese strike force away from its supply bases and into terrain where Goguryeo forces could fight on their own terms. This would require extraordinary skill in strategic deception, perfect timing in tactical execution, and above all, a commander capable of coordinating such a complex operation while maintaining the enemy's confidence in their own ultimate success. It was at this crucial moment that Eulji Mundeok stepped from the shadows of history into the bright light of immortal fame. The mysterious general whose origins remain unknown was about to demonstrate military genius that would be studied and admired for centuries to come. His name would become synonymous with the triumph of intelligence over brute force, of strategic patience over tactical aggression. The Chinese strike force began its advance toward Pyongyang in the early summer of 612. Confident in their superior training, equipment, and leadership, they had every reason for optimism. They represented the cream of the Sui military, supported by the resources of the world's most powerful empire, and commanded by generals whose competence had been proven in numerous previous campaigns. What they could not know was that every step of their advance was being carefully monitored and manipulated by an opponent who understood exactly how to turn their strengths into weaknesses. Eulji Mundeok had been watching, learning, and planning throughout the long months of the siege warfare. And now he was ready to spring the most elaborate and devastating trap in military history. The Chinese advance proceeded smoothly at first, with Goguryeo forces apparently melting away before the superior enemy force. Fortress cities that had resisted the main Chinese army for months suddenly seemed unable to offer effective resistance to the elite strike force. Korean commanders appeared to be evacuating their positions, rather than risk annihilation in hopeless battles. To Yu Zhongwen and Yuan Shu, this apparent collapse of enemy resistance seemed to confirm the wisdom of Yang Dai's new strategy. Where the massive main army had been slowed by the necessity of reducing every fortified position, their mobile force was making rapid progress toward its ultimate objective. Victory seemed not just possible but inevitable. What the Chinese commanders could not see was the careful orchestration behind this apparent success. Every Korean retreat was actually a carefully planned withdrawal, designed to draw the Chinese force deeper into prepared killing zones. Every abandoned fortress had been stripped of useful supplies and equipment, leaving nothing that could benefit the advancing enemy. Every mile of Chinese advance was bringing them closer to the place where Eulji Mundeok intended to destroy them completely. As the Chinese strike force pushed deeper into Goguryeo territory, they began to encounter a new form of resistance that was far more subtle and dangerous than anything they had previously faced. Korean forces would appear as if from nowhere, strike at Chinese supply columns or isolated detachments, then vanish before reinforcements could arrive. These hit-and-run attacks were not intended to stop the Chinese advance, but to weaken it, to create uncertainty and anxiety among troops who had expected easy victory. The psychological effect of these guerrilla tactics was more important than their immediate military impact. Chinese soldiers, accustomed to fighting enemies who stood and fought in conventional formations, found themselves constantly looking over their shoulders for an enemy who might strike at any moment. The confidence that had marked the beginning of their advance began to erode as casualties mounted, and the promised easy victory seemed to recede into the distance. Yet still the Chinese force pressed forward, driven by their commander's determination to reach Pyongyang and achieve the decisive victory that would justify Yang Dai's enormous investment in the Korean campaign. They were now hundreds of miles from their main supply bases, dependent on increasingly tenuous logistics lines that stretched across hostile territory. It was at this moment of maximum Chinese vulnerability that Eulji Mundeok made his most audacious move. Rather than continuing to harass the enemy from the shadows, he decided to reveal himself directly to the Chinese commanders in a deception so bold that its very audacity would help ensure its success. The Korean general who had orchestrated this entire strategic masterpiece was about to walk directly into the enemy camp, presenting himself as a defector willing to betray his own country in exchange for Chinese favor. It was a gamble that could easily have resulted in his capture or death. But it was also the key to the final phase of his plan to destroy the Sui invasion force completely. As Eulji Mundeok prepared for this crucial meeting with his enemies, he carried with him not just the hopes of his kingdom, but the destiny of East Asia itself. The success or failure of his deception would determine whether Korea remained independent or became a Chinese province, whether the Sui Dynasty would establish lasting dominance over the region, or face a defeat so devastating that it would threaten the empire's very survival. The stage was set for one of history's most remarkable examples of psychological warfare. As the master strategist prepared to convince his enemies that their greatest triumph was within reach at the very moment when their destruction was being finalized, the Shadow General was about to step into the light. But his true purpose would remain hidden until the moment of ultimate revelation. The audacity of what Eulji Mundeok was about to attempt defied every convention of military wisdom. Throughout history, generals had sent spies into enemy camps, but rarely had a commanding general personally undertaken such a dangerous mission. Yet as the Korean strategist prepared to enter the Chinese headquarters, he understood that only the highest, raging deception could achieve the psychological impact necessary for his plan's success. The Chinese strike force had advanced deep into Goguryeo territory, their confidence growing with each mile that brought them closer to Pyongyang. To Yu Zhongwan and Yuan Shu, the Korean resistance that had seemed so formidable during the early stages of the invasion now appeared to be crumbling. Enemy forces were retreating before their advance, fortress cities were being abandoned, and victory seemed within their grasp. It was at this moment of apparent Chinese triumph that a small party of Korean envoys approached their forward positions under a flag of truce. The leader of this delegation identified himself as Eulji Mundeok, a high-ranking Goguryeo general who claimed to be seeking terms for his kingdom's surrender. The very fact that such a senior Korean commander would risk coming to the Chinese camp suggested that Goguryeo's position had become desperate indeed. Yu Zhongwan received this unexpected visitor with a mixture of suspicion and anticipation. Chinese intelligence had identified Eulji Mundeok as one of Goguryeo's most capable military leaders, making his apparent defection potentially invaluable for the final assault on Pyongyang. Yet the Chinese commander was also aware that Korean generals had proven remarkably skilled at deception throughout the campaign. The conversations that took place in the Chinese headquarters during Eulji Mundeok's visit were conducted with elaborate courtesy on both sides, each participant carefully studying the other for signs of genuine intent or hidden motive. The Korean general played his role to perfection, presenting himself as a pragmatic commander who recognized that further resistance was futile and sought to minimize the suffering of his people through negotiated surrender. Eulji Mundeok's performance was so convincing that it began to have exactly the effect he had intended. Chinese officers who had grown frustrated by months of difficult siege warfare saw in this apparent defection proof that their strategy was finally bearing fruit. The psychological pressure of facing such an enormous invasion force was clearly breaking the will of even the most dedicated Korean defenders. Yet beneath this surface drama, a far more dangerous game was being played. While presenting himself as a potential defector, Eulji Mundeok was actually conducting a detailed reconnaissance of Chinese capabilities, morale, and intentions. Every conversation provided intelligence about enemy strengths and weaknesses. Every observation revealed details about Chinese logistics and command structure. The Korean general's keenness noted the fatigue evident in Chinese soldiers who had been campaigning 4 months in difficult terrain. He observed the growing strain on supply lines that stretched hundreds of miles across hostile territory. Most importantly, he assessed the psychological state of Chinese commanders, who were under enormous pressure to achieve the decisive victory that Yangdi demanded. What Eulji Mundeok discovered during his dangerous visit confirmed his strategic assessment. The Chinese strike force, despite its elite status and superior equipment, was approaching the limits of its endurance. The very success of their advance had brought them far from their support bases, making them increasingly vulnerable to the kind of coordinated counterattack that he was planning. The most revealing moment of the entire encounter came when Yu Zhongwan attempted to implement secret orders he had received directly from Emperor Yangdi. These instructions were specific and unambiguous. If King Yongyang or Eulji Mundeok ever visited the Chinese camp, they were to be captured immediately and sent to the imperial court as proof of the campaign's success. The attempted capture was prevented only by the intervention of Liu Shilong, a Chinese diplomatic officer who argued that arresting an envoy who had come under a flag of truce would violate the accepted conventions of warfare. This principled stance reflected the better angels of Chinese military tradition, but it also revealed to Eulji Mundeok just how desperate the emperor had become for tangible evidence of progress in the Korean campaign. The Korean general's response to this near disaster demonstrated the quick thinking and psychological insight that made him such a formidable opponent. Rather than fleeing immediately, which might have confirmed Chinese suspicions about his true motives, He maintained his pose as a potential defector, while carefully maneuvering toward a position from which escape would be possible. Yu Zhongwan, frustrated by his failure to capture such a valuable prisoner, attempted a Morsa-L approach. He invited Eulji Mundeok to remain in the Chinese camp as an honored guest, ostensibly to facilitate further negotiations, but actually to keep him under close surveillance until he could be safely detained. The offer was presented with elaborate courtesy, but its true purpose was transparent to anyone with Eulji Mundeok's experience in the deadly games of medieval diplomacy. The Korean general's response was a masterpiece of tactical psychology. He accepted the invitation with apparent gratitude, then gradually began expressing doubts about the wisdom of immediate surrender. Perhaps, he suggested, it would be better for him to return to Pyongyang, to prepare King Yongyang for the necessary negotiations. This approach would take time, but it would ensure that the final settlement was both honorable and lasting. This calculated hesitation served multiple purposes in Eulji Mundeok's overall strategy. It maintained his credibility as a genuine defector who was simply being cautious about such a momentous decision. It provided additional time for him to gather intelligence about Chinese plans and capabilities. Most importantly, it created an opportunity for him to escape before his true identity and intentions could be discovered. The escape itself was executed with the same careful planning that characterized all of Eulji Mundeok's operations. Under the pretense of returning to his own lines to begin the surrender negotiations, the Korean general departed the Chinese camp with appropriate ceremony. Only when he had crossed back to safety did Yu Zhongwan begin to suspect that he had been the victim of an elaborate deception. The Chinese commander's growing suspicions led him to send messengers after the Korean delegation, ostensibly to clarify details of the proposed surrender, but actually to lure Eulji Mundeok back within reach of capture. The response he received confirmed his worst fears. The Korean general had seen through the trap, and had no intention of placing himself again at Chinese mercy. This realization marked a crucial turning point in the campaign. Yu Zhongwan now understood that he was facing an opponent of exceptional cunning and capability. Someone who could match the Chinese not just in military skill, but in the subtle arts of deception and psychological warfare. The confidence that had sustained the Chinese advance began to give way to a more sober assessment of the challenges that lay ahead. The intelligence that Eulji Mundeok had gathered during his dangerous visit to the Chinese camp confirmed his strategic analysis and provided the final details necessary for implementing his master plan. The enemy force was indeed approaching the limits of its logistical capabilities. Its morale was beginning to crack under the strain of prolonged campaigning, and its commanders were under enormous pressure to achieve results that would justify the enormous cost of the invasion. More importantly, the Korean general had observed firsthand the command dynamics within the Chinese leadership. Yu Zhongwan was a competent but conventional commander who followed established military doctrine. Yuan Shu was more experienced but also more cautious, increasingly aware of the risks involved in advancing so far from secure supply lines. The tension between these two approaches created opportunities for an opponent skilled enough to exploit them. As the Chinese strike force resumed its advance toward Pyongyang, Eulji Mundeok put the final elements of his strategy into motion. Korean forces that had been harassing the enemy flanks now began a more systematic withdrawal, creating the impression that organized resistance was collapsing. Fortress cities that might have delayed the Chinese advance were evacuated before they could be besieged, giving the appearance of panic among the defenders. Yet this apparent collapse was actually the most sophisticated phase of Eulji Mundeok's deception. Every Korean withdrawal was carefully coordinated to draw the Chinese deeper into prepared killing zones. Every abandoned position had been stripped of anything useful to the enemy while being prepared with unpleasant surprises for unwary occupiers. Every mile of Chinese advance was bringing them closer to the place where the Korean general intended to destroy them completely. The psychological warfare that accompanied this strategic withdrawal was equally sophisticated. Chinese soldiers, already tired from months of campaigning, found themselves constantly on edge as they advanced through apparently empty territory that could conceal enemies at any moment. The very ease of their progress began to seem momentous rather than encouraging. It was during this period that Eulji Mundeok implemented one of his most brilliant tactical innovations, the staged defeat. Rather than avoiding contact with Chinese forces entirely, Korean units would engage them in seemingly conventional battles, fight with apparent desperation for a time, then retreat in apparent disorder. These false defeats served multiple purposes in the overall strategic plan. First, they maintained Chinese confidence by providing tangible evidence of military success. Second, they exhausted Chinese forces by requiring them to fight repeated engagements even as they advanced. Third, they provided opportunities for Korean commanders to assess enemy capabilities and morale under actual combat conditions. Most importantly, they created a pattern of Korean retreat that would make the final phase of the plan seem like a natural continuation of established trends. The most remarkable example of this tactical deception occurred during a single day when Korean forces engaged the Chinese in 7 separate battles, losing every one of them. To Chinese observers, this seemed like clear evidence that enemy resistance was crumbling under the pressure of sustained assault. In reality, it was a carefully orchestrated performance designed to lure the Chinese into the exact position where Eulji Mundeok wanted them. As the Chinese strike force pushed deeper into Goguryeo territory, supply problems that had been manageable during the early stages of the advance began to become critical. The enormous logistical requirements of maintaining 305,000 soldiers hundreds of miles from their main bases created shortages of food, equipment, and ammunition that could no longer be ignored. Yuan Shu, the more experienced of the 2 Chinese commanders, became increasingly vocal about these problems and began advocating for a strategic withdrawal that would allow the force to resupply and regroup before attempting the final assault on Pyongyang. His arguments were militarily sound but politically unacceptable to Yu Zhongwan, who understood that returning to Emperor Yang without having achieved decisive victory would likely result in disgrace or worse. This disagreement between the Chinese commanders created exactly the kind of discord that Eulji Mundeok had been hoping to exploit. A unified enemy force operating under clear command authority would have been far more difficult to defeat than one torn by internal disagreements about fundamental strategy. The Korean general's careful observation of Chinese command dynamics during his visit to their headquarters now paid dividends as he adjusted his plans to take advantage of enemy disunity. The debate between the Chinese commanders was resolved in the worst possible way from their perspective, a compromise that satisfied neither military necessity. Rather than making a clean withdrawal to secure supply lines, the force would continue its advance but at a reduced pace that would supposedly allow logistics to catch up with tactical requirements. His decision played directly into Eulji Mundeok's hands by ensuring that the Chinese would reach the killing zone he had prepared while still suffering from the supply shortages and command tensions that made them vulnerable to war. The enemy was now exactly where he wanted them, when he wanted them there, and in the weakened condition that made decisive victory possible. As the Chinese force approached the Yalu River and crossed into the final phase of their advance toward Pyongyang, Eulji Mundeok prepared to spring the most elaborate trap in military history. The months of careful preparation, the dangerous intelligence gathering, and the sophisticated psychological warfare had all been leading to this moment when strategic deception would give way to tactical annihilation. The Korean general who had walked into the enemy camp and emerged with the intelligence necessary to ensure their destruction was now ready to complete his masterpiece. The Chinese strike force that had begun its advance with such confidence was about to discover that they had been dancing to his tune from the very beginning, marching step by step toward their own destruction. But even as the trap prepared to close, Eulji Mundeok faced one final test of his psychological warfare skills. The Chinese commanders, despite their growing problems, still retained enough military competence to recognize danger when it became obvious. The final phase of his plan would require not just tactical brilliance, but the ability to maintain enemy confidence until the very moment when escape became impossible. The stage was set for the climactic phase of one of history's most remarkable military campaigns. A force of 305,000 elite soldiers was about to be destroyed by an opponent who had turned their every strength into a weakness and their every advance into a step toward doom. The Shadow General had completed his reconnaissance, and now it was time for the killing blow. The moment of ultimate truth had arrived at the banks of the Salsu River, known today as the Chongkov. Here,
in this seemingly unremarkable waterway flowing through the Korean mountains,
the fate of empires would be decided. The Chinese strike force, 305,000 strong and still confident in their ultimate victory, approached what they believed would be the final obstacle before reaching Pyongyang and claiming the prize that had eluded them for so many months.
Eulji Mundeok stood on the opposite bank, no longer the mysterious figure
who had emerged from historical shadows, but now revealed as the architect of one of the most sophisticated military campaigns in human history. Every element of his grand strategy had led to this moment: the careful intelligence gathering,
the psychological warfare,
the staged retreats, and the masterful deception that had drawn the enemy exactly where he wanted them. The Chinese commanders, Yu Zhongwen and Yuan Shu, surveyed the river crossing with the practiced eyes of veteran soldiers. The Salsu was not particularly wide or deep at this point. Certainly not an insurmountable obstacle for an army of their size and experience. Korean forces were visible on the far bank, but they appeared to be in the same state of disorganized retreat that had characterized their recent behavior. What the Chinese could not see was the months of careful preparation that had transformed this apparently ordinary river crossing into a killing ground of unprecedented lethality. Eulji Mundeok had chosen this location not for its natural defensive qualities, which were modest, but for the tactical opportunities it would provide once his trap was fully sprung. The Korean general's strategy depended on precise timing and perfect coordination between multiple elements of his force. Korean troops visible to the Chinese were only a small portion of the forces that Eulji Mundeok had positioned around the crossing site.
Hidden in the surrounding hills and forests
were thousands of additional warriors, waiting for the signal that would transform what appeared to be another routine river crossing into a massacre of historic proportions. As the Chinese began their crossing, everything proceeded exactly as Eulji Mundeok had calculated. The lead elements of the enemy force entered the water and began making their way across, meeting only token resistance from Korean defenders who seemed more interested in continuing their retreat than in making a serious stand. The ease of the crossing reinforced Chinese confidence that final victory was within their grasp. The Chinese commanders, despite their growing logistical problems and mounting fatigue, allowed themselves to believe that they were finally witnessing the collapse of organized Korean resistance. The pattern of retreats and defeats that had characterized recent weeks seemed to be reaching its inevitable conclusion at this remote river crossing. Soon, the road to Pyongyang would be open, and Emperor Yangdai's grand ambitions would be realized. Yu Zhongwen ordered the crossing to proceed with maximum speed, eager to maintain momentum and prevent any possibility of Korean forces regrouping on the far bank. Roughly half of the 305,000-man force had made it across the Salsu when Eulji Mundeok decided that the moment had come to reveal the trap that had been months in the making. The signal came not with fanfare but with deadly efficiency. Korean forces that had appeared to be in disorderly retreat suddenly wheeled around with military precision, their apparent panic revealed as masterful acting. Simultaneously, thousands of hidden warriors emerged from concealed positions in the surrounding terrain, their war cries echoing across the valley as they closed in on the exposed Chinese positions. The tactical brilliance of Eulji Mundeok's plan became immediately apparent. By allowing exactly half the Chinese force to cross before launching his attack, He had divided the enemy army at its most vulnerable moment. The troops who had already crossed found themselves trapped between the river behind them and Korean forces attacking from multiple directions. Those still on the opposite bank were separated from their comrades by a waterway that had suddenly become an impassable barrier. The Chinese soldiers who had crossed the river faced a nightmare scenario that no amount of training or experience could have prepared them for. They were cut off from reinforcement or retreat, surrounded by enemies who knew the terrain intimately, and commanded by officers who had no clear understanding of what was happening around them. The confident advance had become a desperate struggle for survival in a matter of minutes. Korean tactics during the assault demonstrated the same sophisticated planning that had characterized the entire campaign. Rather than launching a single massive attack that might have allowed some Chinese forces to break through and escape, Eulji Mundeok coordinated multiple smaller assaults that systematically destroyed enemy cohesion while preventing any organized withdrawal. The slaughter that followed was methodical and complete. Chinese forces trapped on the Korean side of the river fought with the desperation of men who understood that surrender was not an option. But their courage could not overcome the hopelessness of their tactical situation. One by one, the elite units that had represented the cream of the Sui military were surrounded and annihilated by Korean forces, fighting with the fury of defenders protecting their homeland. Some Chinese commanders attempted to rally their men for breakout attempts that might have saved at least a portion of the force. But these efforts were anticipated and countered by Korean dispositions that had been planned for exactly such contingencies. Eulji Mundeok had studied his enemies so thoroughly that he could predict their responses and prepare appropriate countermeasures before they were even attempted. The troops remaining on the original side of the river could only watch in horror as their comrades were systematically destroyed. Any attempt to cross and provide assistance would only have resulted in additional casualties, while retreat meant abandoning half their army to certain death. The psychological impact of witnessing such a complete tactical disaster shattered the morale of even veteran soldiers, who had survived numerous previous campaigns. As the day wore on and the scope of the disaster became undeniable, the Chinese forces still capable of movement began a withdrawal that quickly degenerated into full-scale retreat. The disciplined advance that had brought them so close to their objective became a panicked flight as soldiers abandoned equipment, supplies, and wounded comrades in their desperate attempt to escape the killing ground that the Salsu River had become. Eulji Mundeok's pursuit was as carefully planned as every other aspect of his campaign. Rather than allowing the retreating Chinese to escape and possibly regroup for another assault, Korean forces harassed the withdrawal every step of the way. Hit and run attacks, ambushes at river crossings, and constant pressure from multiple directions ensured that the Chinese retreat became almost as costly as the initial battle had been. The numbers that emerged from this catastrophe were almost too staggering to believe. Of the 305,000 elite soldiers who had begun the advance toward Pyongyang with such confidence, fewer than 3,000 managed to make it back to the main Chinese army. The rest had been killed, captured, or simply disappeared during the retreat through hostile territory. It was a rate of casualties so extreme that it defied conventional military experience. The Battle of Salsu River represented more than just a tactical victory for Goguryeo. It was a strategic catastrophe for the Sui Empire that would ultimately prove fatal to the dynasty itself. The loss of such an enormous and elite force dealt a blow to Chinese military capabilities from which the empire would never fully recover. More importantly, the psychological impact of such a complete defeat shattered the aura of invincibility that had sustained Chinese expansion under Yang Dai's rule. Emperor Yang Dai's response to news of the disaster revealed the megalomania that had driven his disastrous Korean policy from the beginning. Rather than accepting that his ambitions had proven unrealistic and withdrawing to consolidate what remained of Chinese power, he doubled down on his commitment to Korean conquest. The emperor ordered new invasions in 613 and 614, pouring additional resources into a campaign that had already proven to be a strategic dead end.
These follow-up invasions achieved nothing beyond further weakening the Sui Empire,
and providing additional evidence that Yangde had learned nothing from the catastrophe at Salsu River. Each new campaign drained resources that could have been used to address the growing internal problems that were beginning to threaten the dynasty's survival. Each failure further undermined the emperor's credibility and encouraged potential rebels to believe that the regime was vulnerable. The internal consequences of the Korean disasters soon became apparent throughout the Sui Empire. Rebellions that might have been easily suppressed under normal circumstances now found widespread support among populations that had been drained by the enormous costs of Yang Dai's foreign adventures. The emperor who had dreamed of surpassing his predecessor's achievements instead found himself presiding over the collapse of everything his father had built. By 618, just 6 years after the disaster at Salsu River, the Sui Dynasty had collapsed entirely. Destroyed by internal rebellions that drew much of their strength from popular anger over the Korean campaigns. Yangde himself was assassinated by his own guards. A fitting end for a ruler whose grandiose ambitions had led his empire to ruin. The dynasty that had seemed so powerful and permanent, had been brought down by its inability to digest the conquest of a single Korean kingdom. The strategic implications of Eulji Mundeok's victory extended far beyond the immediate survival of Goguryeo, or even the fall of the Sui Dynasty. The demonstration that Chinese military superiority was not absolute encouraged other neighboring peoples to resist imperial expansion, fundamentally altering the balance of power throughout East Asia. The Tang dynasty that eventually replaced the Sui would prove more cautious about foreign adventures, having learned from their predecessors' mistakes. For Korea itself, the victory at Salsu River established a tradition of successful resistance to foreign invasion that would inspire future generations facing their own seemingly impossible odds. The tactics and strategies that Eulji Mundeok had pioneered, the use of terrain as a weapon, the importance of intelligence and deception, and the power of unified resistance against divided enemies, would be studied and emulated by Korean commanders for centuries to come. The personal fate of Eulji Mundeok after his great victory remains as mysterious as his origins. Having accomplished the impossible task of destroying a vastly superior enemy force and saving his kingdom from conquest, the Shadow General seems to have returned to the obscurity from which he had emerged. No records survive of his later career, his family life, or even his death. He appears in history like a force of nature, accomplishes his mission, and then vanishes as completely as if he had never existed. This absence of personnel detail has only added to Eulji Mundeok's legendary status in Korean historical memory. Freed from the limitations of ordinary human biography, he has become a symbol of Korean ingenuity, determination, and strategic brilliance that transcends any individual personality. He represents the idea that intelligence and careful planning can overcome any disadvantage. That small nations can defeat great empires if they fight intelligently, rather than heroically. Modern military historians studying the Battle of Salsu River have identified it as one of the most perfect examples of strategic deception and tactical execution in recorded history. The coordination required to manage such a complex operation, the psychological insight necessary to manipulate enemy decision-making, and the timing needed to spring the trap at exactly the right moment, all demonstrate military genius of the highest order. The influence of Eulji Mundeok's victory can be traced through centuries of subsequent military thought and practice. His use of feigned retreats and false defeats influenced tactical development throughout East Asia, while his integration of intelligence gathering, psychological warfare, and conventional military operations established a model for asymmetric warfare that remains relevant today. In Korea, Eulji Mundeok has achieved a status that transcends ordinary historical commemoration. He is remembered not just as a successful general, but as the embodiment of the Korean spirit of resistance to foreign domination. His victory at Salsu River stands as proof that Korean independence was not a gift from more powerful neighbors, but something that was earned through the courage and intelligence of Korean defenders. The contrast between the enormous Chinese invasion force and the relatively modest Korean kingdom that defeated it has become a powerful metaphor for Goguryeo. Time and again throughout Korean history, the peninsula's people have faced seemingly impossible odds and found ways to preserve their independence through ingenuity, determination, and unity in the face of external threats. Schools throughout Korea teach the story of Eulji Mundeok's victory as an example of how individual brilliance in service of the common good can achieve results that pure force never could. His willingness to risk his own life by entering the enemy camp, his patient development of a complex strategic plan, and his perfect execution of that plan under enormous pressure, all serve as models for how Koreans should respond to future challenges. The poem that Eulji Mundeok sent to Yu Jongwon during the campaign has become one of the most famous literary works in Korean history. Studied not just for its tactical psychological impact, but for its elegant demonstration of how culture and warfare could be combined to achieve strategic objectives. The ability to compose classical Chinese poetry, while simultaneously orchestrating the destruction of a Chinese army, epitomizes the sophisticated integration of intellectual and military capabilities that Korean tradition celebrates. The archaeological evidence from the Salsu River battlefield, while limited by the passage of centuries, has confirmed the essential accuracy of historical accounts describing the battle's scale and outcome. Artifacts discovered in the region include Chinese weapons and armor from the Sui period, providing physical testimony to the reality of Eulji Mundeok's triumph and the completeness of the Chinese defeat. International recognition of Eulji Mundeok's achievements has grown as military historians have gained a better understanding of the complexity and sophistication of his strategic plan. The Battle of Salsu River is now included in military academy curricula around the world, as an example of how superior strategy and tactics can overcome overwhelming numerical disadvantages when executed with sufficient skill and determination. The enduring fascination with Eulji Mundeok's story reflects humanity's eternal loyalty. In an age when military success was typically measured by the size of armies and the wealth of treasuries, his triumph demonstrated that individual genius could still change the course of history when applied with sufficient skill and determination. As we reach the end of Eulji Mundeok's story, we are left with the image of a man who emerged from obscurity to save his nation, and then returned to that same obscurity. Content with having accomplished his mission, he sought no personal glory, established no dynasty, and left no monuments to his own greatness. His only memorial is the continued independence of the Korea he died to defend. The general who destroyed an empire and changed the course of history remains one of the most enigmatic figures in the annals of warfare. We know almost nothing about who he was as a person, but we know everything about what he accomplished as a strategic genius. In the end, perhaps that is exactly as he would have wanted it, remembered not for who he was, but for what he achieved in service of something greater than himself, in the quiet waters of the Salsu River, where autumn leaves now drift peacefully downstream. The ghost of that ancient battle still whispers its lessons to those wise enough to listen. The shadow general who saved a kingdom and toppled an empire achieved immortality not through monuments of stone, but through the living memory of a grateful nation that understands what it owes to his sacrifice and brilliance. Close your eyes and let these whispered memories carry you to peaceful sleep.